Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this AHDB Strategic Farm event featuring our Lincolnshire Strategic Farmer, Chris Elkington. My name is Sarah Pick, and I look after Chris as part of my role as a Knowledge Exchange Manager for Beef and Lamb. This afternoon, we'll hear from Chris, as well as his consultant, Dr. Liz Genever, who has been helping him improve his grass and forage management, as well as other topics as well. But before we hear from our speakers, I'm just going to run through the technology so that you know how to ask questions throughout. If you could just turn over the slide, Liz. So to ask a question, you just need to click on the arrow, the orange arrow, and this will open up your toolbar options. Then if you scroll down, you'll see a question box with an arrow on the left-hand side. Again, click on that arrow and that will expand the question box. Type your question in there and then just remember to press send. My colleague, Joseph Keating, he will be keeping an eye on the questions and will be asking them throughout. So we'll be stopping every 10 minutes or so to go through the questions that you've asked. Next slide, please, Liz. So we're covering a range of different topics today, which Chris has identified as his focus areas. Each one of them helps Chris meet his objective of increasing lamb performance from grass and forage. And this includes setting up fencing and rotational grazing, tackling lamb growth rates, measuring grass and forage, and also we'll touch on the plans for the autumn and winter months. So as I've said, we will have regular question breaks throughout the webinar. So please do make sure you keep sending those questions in. And remember, there are no silly questions. We'll aim to end the webinar no later than 1:30. So let's get cracking. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Elkington. So Chris farms alongside his wife, Louise, in Grantham, Lincolnshire. They joined the Strategic Farm programme at the end of last year, and since then they've done a lot of brilliant stuff. So Chris, can you just start by just giving a brief introduction to your business?
Yeah, hello, I'm Chris. We farm up at Gelston in near Grantham, Lincolnshire. We're running around the 500 mark now of ewes, with 110 acre at home. We have a catering business and a butchery business that obviously runs alongside them as Gelston Lamb.
Yeah, and your flock is split into two, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have an indoor flock and an outdoor flock. Obviously, we need lambs sort of nearly all year round. So to split lambing, it makes sense to get different time lambs coming fit. We took all our ewe lambs as well, and they're run as a separate mob as well.
Yeah, and who helps on the farm? Is it just yourself and your wife?
So it's me and Louise, and we also have an employee called Rachel, and she works for us 3 days a week now, mostly butchery, delivering, but on farm as well when we need her.
Yeah. And is all of your land, is it grassland or arable, or how is it split?
It's all grass at home. There's 110 acres here at Gelston, which is all grass. We rent bits of grass off farm as well, with sort of another 35 acre where the ewe lambs are, and there's a bit more here and there. And then we have in the winter we have sort of arable units that we put stubble turnips in, and this year we've just started grazing some cover crops for someone else. So
brilliant. And just my final question: when do you lamb those two flocks?
So the indoor lot we will lamb. We're sort of mid to end of February, and then everything else is April. We normally start 1st of April for mainly the outdoor, the ewes, the ewe lambs will be sort of 10 days later.
Brilliant.
Just,
Thank you,
just
Chris.
yeah.
Lovely. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction to Chris's system, but if you do have any questions, again, please do send them in. So we'll move on now to our first topic for this afternoon, which is looking at rotational grazing. So Chris, why did you decide you wanted to implement rotational grazing?
We've wanted to start really just to get the most out of our grass, you know, and we want to be limited fertiliser use as well. But rotational grazing, I think, is the best thing for the sheep and for the farm. Really, you can utilise your grass far more with doing it. That's what I want to do it really.
And why move away from fertiliser?
I wouldn't say I'm not going to move completely away, but it would be nice to certainly reduce our amount used. You know, if we can do without sort of bagged N, then it's got to be a good thing for it's a massive cost on the farm really, is fertiliser. You know, if it's something we can manage differently and, you know, manage without, then it's got to be a benefit to the business. And to the environment, really.
Definitely. So you have started rotational grazing this year. How has it gone?
Yeah, we started this year, not as early as I'd have liked because we probably hadn't got enough fencing to start with. But we have implemented it, and it's gone very well, really. I think the grass has looked as best as it's ever looked with the few fields that we've done. Whereas I wouldn't say we didn't rotational graze, but we didn't do it in such smaller paddocks. You know, we used to move them from field to field and kept them moving like that. But we've been quite strict in splitting the fields up and moving them on a 3-day move when we got going, and it's a definite benefit. I mean, the lambs were growing very well in the earlier season.
Yeah, and roughly what acreage are you rotational grazing, and how many ewes and lambs have you been grazing over that area?
We were probably roughly about 50 acre, I think, this time. But that would be around about 200 ewes and lambs doing that. But going forward, now we've got more fencing, I think we'll certainly implement it earlier next year and try and get most of the farm split up, you know, just after lambing and get them moving earlier.
Yeah, that's it. But I suppose that's the good thing about rotational grazing. You can start small, learn stuff, and then gradually increase the acreage that you're doing. So if I could just bring Liz in now. When you're looking at rotational grazing, do you need a lot of infrastructure? Is it quite expensive to set up?
So quite a lot of the time we try and understand how the fields are currently set up. So it could be that actually if you've already got quite small paddocks on your farm already, you can actually use the historical infrastructure, and what you end up doing is just making slightly bigger groups and moving them around the fields you've already got. In reality, particularly when you're, as Chris is, which is more in an arable based area, you tend to have bigger fields. So Chris is quite fortunate that all of his fields are sort of really have good external fencing, so they're fenced all the way around. So it's sort of internal sort of fence lines, as you can see in the images on the screen, that he was particularly focusing on. So that, I mean, it's quite a nice situation to be in, rather than having to fence the externals and then also think about sort of the internal divisions as well. So there's always going to be an investment. A lot of people would have electric fencing systems on farm already. Some of them haven't necessarily been out for a bit, but in anything that you can put on farm, the return on investment in fencing, if the rotational grazing is managed well, can be returned within a year. It's probably the best return on investment of anything you can put on farm.
Wow, no, that's really good to hear. And setting up water troughs, is that a bit of an issue, or can that be made easier?
So, well, Chris, there's a really nice example of what Chris has done there, which is it's a what they were about 150, 200 quid, aren't they, those water tanks that are quite mobile, and then putting just a sort of well, you can see the blue sort of water pipe running across the land to that connector, and then that every time those animals are moved, the fence is either moved either side of it or that's tipped out and then relocated. So it can be done quite simply. Alternatively, if you've got a tank already in that field, you can design the fencing systems around that existing tank. So fencing and water are the two things that put people off of rotational grazing, and actually there's quite simple solutions to get round it if you really want to.
We're quite fortunate that we've got sort of water troughs in every field. So all I did was just turn off and unclip the old water, or the existing water trough, and then I've just bought another 100-metre length of pipe and just run it on top to that trough, and I do it so it's in the centre of the 4 paddocks, if you like, and I just keep chucking it in each paddock when they move. So it's quite straightforward, really.
Yeah.
And do you mean there's a bit more? Sorry, Sarah. There's a bit more to think about if we've got cattle in the system. Here is only sheep, so we've just got to make sure there's enough water pressure to satisfy big groups of cattle. But there's quite a lot of guidance out there on these sort of temporary water systems.
Brilliant. Chris, I forgot to ask you, what breeds of sheep do you have?
What breeds does he not have is the question.
We like lots of breed of sheep. We have Aberfield cross clins for the outdoor lot. Indoor, we've got a mixture of sort of Rotational mules. Again, there's some Aberfield clins. We sort of run the indoor flock as a bee flock, which Liz recommended. So anything that's not really performing outside goes into the bee flock for its last chance. So there's a few clins in there as well. But we're getting really, so we're nearly all clin across Aberfields now, with a few Rotational mules kicking about.
And the Romney crosses?
No, I've forgotten about them, yeah. Some Romney crosses as well.
Won't mention those. No, that's lovely. Thanks, Chris. So if we look at the photo on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the finishing lambs, isn't it? That are rotational grazing there.
Yeah, that's the finishing lambs.
Yeah, and one of the things that probably people will notice as they're looking at that photo is the creep feeders.
Well, yeah.
So
we're just at the early stages at it, really. We've got the idea is really to get away from feeding creep, but until we get our grass management right and get the grass performing, I just don't think we can finish lambs to what spec we need. Good enough, really. So that's why we put a bit of creep in with them.
Yeah.
And how many? Sorry, Sarah.
Sorry, go on, Liz.
But also in terms of you need a certain number, don't you, per week as well? So it just gives you a bit more security.
Yeah, it gives us a bit more control, really, as well. And I think really they finish nicer on a bit of food as well. What we need really at certain times of the year. I mean, we were killing lambs off the mums, with no food at all earlier on. It's just as the grass sort of loses its quality when we start needing a bit of food.
Yeah.
But going forward, we'll look to try and manage without it completely.
And Liz, for Chris to be able to do that, what are the things he's going to have to maybe change or do differently to ensure he can finish more off grass?
So I think because we're sort of a year in nearly, aren't we, into those rotational grazing systems. So over time, that grass quality will shift. So you'll have hopefully a high proportion of white clover and sort of the more productive grass species. We'll talk about in a bit, but he's also putting in herbal leys. So that gives opportunities to put lambs on different crops that might help that growth rate and finish rate. But it's also, there's partly genetics. It's also selecting the rams that put a bit more fat down based on doing it from an estimated breeding value perspective, but also so that simple lamb management. So it's keeping an eye on worms, trace elements, all of those factors that are promoting lamb growth rates will potentially also affecting how the level of finish. But I think it's also worth looking at the genetic side as well.
Right, okay, and that might be something then we can focus on over the next couple of years. I think it's important to say that, you know, this year has been particularly tricky with the grass due to the weather that we've had. Chris, how have you managed it?
I think with us being understocked, reasonably understocked, we've sort of got away with it really this time. But in sort of May, I mean, we'd got grass burning off, you know, on the lighter land. It looked like August really. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And then we're sort of, it was about end of June time really, July really, when we had our spring growth of grass. Which was really quite tricky to, especially with the lambs. I think it didn't do them any favours at all, not having that grass when they wanted it, you know, at weaning and stuff like that. So it was a bit of a job to manage it, but we got away with it really, just purely because we were understocked.
Yeah, and Liz, do you have any tips on managing?
And I think, well, as you said, this year was particularly interesting from that extreme of wet to then very dry to then now back to wet. But so I think it is, and we'll talk a bit again in terms of Chris's measuring and measuring grass and having an understanding of what's out there. He also has this ambition in terms of stocking rates. That's something we're sort of working towards. And certainly Chris and others generally benefit from, well, both in terms of the strategic farm network, but discussion groups. So doing it's sharing experiences from other people. And what's nice about discussion groups is generally you're with people that are dealing with the same weather events. So it's just sharing tips within them. And certainly some people would be using creep this year, particularly because the high lamb prices, and that's how they got around some of that varied between when the land really properly dried out. So this year is particularly tricky, but monitoring grass and then acting quickly based on that information is probably what got the best people through the situation this year.
Yeah, and it's funny you should mention discussion groups, because you actually run one near Chris, don't you? So which region does your grazing discussion group cover?
So it's sort of within the Welland Valley, so sort of bottom end of South Lincolnshire through to Rutland into sort of Northampton and also into Leicestershire. So it's in that sort of chunk, really.
Okay, so if anybody is interested in that, do get in touch with Liz, because it really is a good group to be involved with. Joseph, I might bring you in now. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we just have one or two coming through. Probably something we didn't say actually is why is Liz on the call? So Liz is the consultant to Chris.
Sarah did say.
Yeah, just don't just come in asking that. I think you're obviously your reputation.
To me.
Yeah, your reputation precedes you, Liz. So we don't have to do introductions. So the first question, breeds come up, so you've that covered. Just on, because you mentioned your catering side of your business, Chris, and finish. So one question on that is, do you have to look? Do you look to have a better finish, so to speak, for those caterings than you do maybe for the more supermarket abattoir lambs?
Yeah, I mean, we sell a few sort of dead weight, and you can get away with a lot leaner lamb. Whereas our customers, you know, we need quite a bit of finish on them really. They want a little bit of fat content, so we like to finish them a bit more for that side of things, rather than you can get away with, you know, a lot leaner lamb if you go to a supermarket.
It is. I think it is an interesting point that the two different markets, people don't want to buy fat at retail, but often it's a perception of quality, I suppose, that for the more direct sales.
They don't want too much fat. There's a fine line, but they just need a bit of cover on, you know.
So you'd be doing a 3L, 3H type area, or moving towards a
4? I would really be a 3H really for our job, you know, or a 4. It wouldn't bother me if we were 4s, 3H4s for our own sort of butchery side of things. Whereas if I was drawing for Dumbia or Randall Parker, then you know, a 3L is fine.
And then the last question for now is, I think you mentioned it earlier, but also mentioned it in your videos that went out this week on social media, that you work with some neighbours, some grazing. So just, you know, how does that work? Do you have a good relationship? Do you have any control over the management of that grassland, or is it just pretty much you go in and graze what's there?
Some of it, yes, some of it we take on all year round. Others, it's just in the winter where we just go and graze it off and move on again. But most of it's in sort of blocks, so we can take a fair amount of sheep to go do that job. But yeah, we've got good relationships with most of our neighbours, and especially where we have sheep in the winter, we have a good relationship there.
Cool. That's it for now, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. So we'll move on to our next topic, which is the ewe lamb management. So Chris, can you just explain how you've managed the ewe lambs this year and the problems you've encountered?
Well, they've been a nightmare, really. We've put them on to they were brilliant to start with. 8-week weights, they were above average. 12 weeks weight, they were above average. They were around about the 2 kilo above your AHDB average, and we just thought they were doing really well. Then we weaned. And I think the first week they did okay on the red clover, weaned onto a silage aftermath, which was the red clover that we put in last year. And then that's when we started having problems, really. I think there were just such spikes in their growth. And it almost seemed when they went onto the red clover, they either didn't do anything or they dropped a little bit. And then we put them on to the other rotation, which had grass and white clover in. And then they would pick up again. And then as soon as you put them back on the red clover, they would drop again or stay the same. And they did that throughout, really. We'd taken blood samples from them. We bolused everything. We iodine drenched everything. We were trying to eliminate things. We'd removed some food that we were trialing for somebody, like a straw pellet. We removed that. We thought whether that was upsetting them or something, but nothing really came back. Bloods came back fine on all aspects. So we've put it down to, well, the red clover, maybe not spending enough time on it. We still don't really know what's gone on, but Liz might tell you better than I can. But yeah, there's still thought processes going on about it, really. But they're off farm now. We've moved them all off this week, and they're on to their cover crop, which we shan't. Liz did mention that we might have been weighing them too often, so we were weighing every week, just to try and monitor them and keep an eye on their growth. But whether that was upsetting them as well, it's a possibility, I guess. So they're off farm now, and they're on some cover crop. We'll weigh sort of probably every 2 weeks, and if they're growing, then I shall probably just leave them alone and just probably weigh before tupping.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say you're also really good at doing your fecal egg counting, so we know that's not a problem.
No, we were regularly, we were regularly doing it. As soon as they needed worming, we would worm. We went through Resolvix with them as well. So yeah, no, we've been active in that, and if I had a high worm burden, we would worm accordingly. So we had to feed them in the end. We put a bit of grass, barley pellet into them just to get their weight up, because they weren't going to reach the weight for tupping, so we had to feed them a little bit.
Yeah.
That was literally only 2 weeks.
What weight is that, Chris? What do you want to get them to?
Well, ideally they want to be anything over 40 kilo, but I would really like them to be around about 42, 43 at tupping, which now, I mean, they're averaging, the group average is 42.5 now, so really I think we should be all right, especially if we get on this cover crop and get settled down on that. I think it'll just add a few more kilos as well.
That's it. So I'll bring Liz in now. So what does that graph show on screen, and what have we concluded from this?
Chris has just taken us through a bit, sort of the explanation of what this graph is trying to show you. So the big blue arrow is sort of the target weight we're aiming for. So in ewe lambs, we're looking at sort of 60 to 65% of their mature weight. That's what they need to be at tupping. So then you ask, what is the definition of mature weight? But generally we're working on sort of 65, 70 kilos for the type of sheep that Chris is running. So that's sort of heading in that plus 40 kilos really. The bit at the top is sort of this sort of what they were grazing at the certain times. So that's the grass and white clover, and then you can see that as it shifts towards red clover. And this was a conversation that Chris and I had, and because of the level of white clover in that grass sward, I didn't think it would have that much disruption from moving them between, but I think some of what we've encountered is the disruption of the change of diet.
Okay.
But what was interesting,
and what percentage of white clover is in that sward?
We're sort of looking anywhere up 30% plus. It's,
Right,
do you mean,
okay.
it will vary across the year, but it's certainly not got one bit of white clover in it. It's a reasonable take of white clover. So I think there's probably something in it about that transition. And what's interesting, Chris has just moved some of the weather lambs onto that red clover, and then they also started to lose weight on the red clover. So we've got to do some investigation in terms of what is going on in that field. Really, it's just interesting, and it'd be interesting if anybody on the call has had experience of that, either red clover causing a problem or the transition from white clover to red clover causing a problem in lamb growth rates. The three sort of lines that you see on that graph, the middle green one is the average, so that's the group average. The higher blue one is the sort of top 25% of lambs, what the average is. Then the bottom blue one is the sort of bottom 25% of lambs and where they're sitting. So you can see actually as a group, they're quite consistent as they sort of travel up over that time. And to get them from 30 kilos ish to 45 kilos by the time of topping, they need to be gaining about 125 grams a day on average. And these girls were doing about 115, which is the number you see on the side. So they weren't that far off what they needed to do, but as Chris sort of alluded to, they did it in a really frustrating pattern, so that it was like in surges and then declines. And I suppose what we should also say is that we don't necessarily have the historical data of what they did of the ewe lambs last year. Certainly we know they weren't probably up to weight target, but did they also see this sort of quite sort of flip-flopping in terms of weight gain? What you can definitely see is the response rate of when those animals go on to creep. So you can see that big increase in weight in sort of early October is after the introduction of that barley grass pellet. So it sort of links back to those conversations about finishing levels and all of that, which is they seem to be very responsive to cereals going into that grass-based diet. So we have to also look at, and we have red clover in it, so we assumed that forage quality was good enough, but we just have to have a bit of a better look in terms of what they're eating and what do we need to get them to put them on to get that 120 grams a day. And certainly my expectation would be they would be easily doing that on a red clover rotation. Okay. So that was what was surprising.
And I know when we were just discussing the finishing lambs, you mentioned about genetics. Do you think this would play a part again with the ewe lamb growth and their response to concentrates? Is that
partly? And it's to do with how they've. Do you mean have they been selected on systems which are using concentrates? Yeah. But it's also concentrates. The reason why they are used is because they put a concentrated form of energy into animals and they have a response rate accordingly. The question that we need to ask Chris's system as a wider thing, which is if you want to reduce concentrate use, we have to put those animals under pressure where concentrates aren't being used and see which animals perform under that more grass and forage based system. That, do you mean, it's a wider question, but I think it's not a surprise that those animals react to concentrates as well as they do. It's just whether we would love to have a system where we didn't need to put them in to gain that extra 2 to 3 kilos. Yeah. But as Chris said, we were concerned at the sort of rate of gain they were doing before that concentrate went in sort of end of September. The trajectory wasn't steep enough. They needed that boost to get them to where they are now, and now it's been removed, and it'll be interesting to see what that response now is because they're just on forage.
Okay, so knowing what we know now, then what do you plan to do differently next year?
Which who's it directed?
So Chris is looking at me blankly, so I'll come to you, Liz.
So I think, and it was the irony is that an element of we're trying to encourage farmers to weigh, and we're saying actually you're weighing them too frequently. So we do have to ask a question of whether that, because of the frequency of weighing, are we upsetting those lambs? So maybe we actually will end up weighing every fortnight. We do need to go in sooner with a blood sample historically we have got issues with iodine on this farm, so that's why we assumed it was an iodine issue, but actually we needed to go in earlier with some of that. And certainly the worm, during the work they're doing on fecal egg counts, will continue, and then we'll react to that in terms of as those egg counts get to a point where wormers need to go. So a lot of it is similar, but I'm not sure they'll be on. And certainly the rotation needs to be more settled, so they need to be on either just white clover, and we have to be quite careful. We were planning to take them off red clover far enough away from tupping for it to not have a big impact on them, but we also just have to be careful about how long they're on red clover, because it will have some impact on fertility.
Okay.
I think we'll bolus as well. We'll bolus at weaning this time, I think, rather than sort of wait. We wait until I think we'll bolus at weaning, see if that helps.
And what will you bolus them with, Chris?
So just a standard, probably just a standard lamb bolus at that point. Just with the iodine and the selenium and cobalt, and just get that in there to them, so they've got it in their bloods in good time.
Yeah, and those lambs that don't reach target weight, what will you do with them?
They will probably end up we'll pull them all out. Anything that's not target weight will get pulled out this time. If I like the look of them, we might run them to a shearling, but if they're just underperforming and they've been underperforming, then they'll just get killed.
Yeah. Okay.
But, if they're a smart looking sheep and they are performing well, they might just because they're a smaller lamb or whatever, we might just give them another go. But if they're underperforming, if it's that bottom line, if they say all those that are at the bottom 25, they'll just go.
Right. Okay. No, that's fine. And you did touch on the iodine deficiency. Do you just want to quickly mention what that was and what you've done to rectify it?
Yeah, we were deficient. We're deficient in iodine on the farm. I think probably most farms are actually. So we had a right trouble with it last year with the ewes at lambing, or the year before with the lambing, and we corrected that by drenching with an iodine drench, and then we went through and bolused everything. But this year, we've just gone through with the bolus earlier. We've bolused again. So they've sort of had 2 years with a bolus now, and we're hoping that that's keeping them all in check with it.
Brilliant. And Liz, did you have some more graphs to go through?
Yeah, I think it's just a hint at, in terms of, this actually comes from an AHD project called Challenge Sheep, and it just sort of hints at that importance of getting we've talked about these target weights and the importance of getting those target weights up. So this is just some data from one farm for 1 year, so we have to be quite cautious. There's quite a lot going on this slide, but we're really focusing on the blue lines. The red line being the target weight for this group of ewe lambs. So you can see at tupping, they went over their target weight at tupping. By scanning, they're at sort of 80% of mature weight. And again, by the time their lambs were 8 weeks, they were heading up towards sort of mature weight, defined at about 65 kilos. So what we're interested in that is that then led to the lambs from those ewe lambs that had hit and exceeded the targets in terms of tupping and at scanning and heading towards 8 weeks, had lambs that were probably about 5 kilos heavier than the target for lambs from ewe lambs. So it just demonstrates the importance of getting that weight on ewe lambs and to keep them growing. And the impact you didn't see as strong from shearlings. It was this real big impact on ewe lambs. How this was achieved on this farm was actually the use of herbal leys. Then on a separate farm, we saw that during tupping, the ewe lambs did not hit their target, and they weren't really actively managed during that winter time. So they were below target almost all the way through to their lambs being 8 weeks. And what that meant is that the lambs off those ewe lambs were 4 kilos lighter than average. So it just, again, it just helped to sort of re-emphasize why we focus so much on getting these ewe lambs up to that weight. And have probably, there's been quite a lot of investment, both in terms of time and also things going into them or accessing creep. But you can see the return on investment is that on that is because of the lamb performance that will come off those ewe lambs once they get to weight
That's
and
it.
then manage.
Brilliant.
What we found with our ewe lambs last year, they got neglected. Really, it was my own fault, I guess, as well. But the weather was atrocious. You know, it was very wet, wasn't it? And they've struggled really all the way through. And as a shearling now, it's hit them. You know, they're not great shearlings. So it just shows you've really got to manage them well and keep them growing is the biggest thing. Is keep some good food in front of them and keep them moving. You know, and it's a very difficult and fine line because you think, oh, I'll keep them growing, but then you've got to be careful at lambing. You know, you mustn't get the lambs too big, or actually have all sorts of trouble, like we did one year as well. You know, it's all a learning curve because we're still learning, but I'm hoping this year's the year that we get it semi-right.
No, that's brilliant. Joseph, do we have any questions on the ewe lambs?
So we just have a few questions. One, Chris, I'll go the first one to you. Is the grazing ground historically grass ground, or is it a new ley in an arable land? The red clover, I think.
The red clover was put in a year ago into an old grass ley. It's been grass for sort of 10 years, I would say, and I pulled it out. It's been reseeded. It's always been a grass field, but I reseeded it probably 3 years ago with grass. It looked like a cutting ley and a grazing ley, and then I didn't spray it off. I just dished it up and then drilled the red clover in on top of it, so it's got some grass through it as well. You know, that came through from the old sward.
Brilliant.
But yeah, everything else is fairly new leys at home. You know, it was all arable, and it's all been 4 or 5 years in with the grass ley now.
The next one, I suppose, is more for you, Liz. Is it? Do you think it's a true weight loss from going on to the red clover, or is it a gut fill effect? And would you expect more rapid rumen flow on red clover? So is it just that they're not as full?
And I suppose the difficulty is that sometimes those weight events coincided when they were moved between fields as well. So the challenge we've got with that frequent weighing is that the gut fill content will have quite a big impact. The advantage we have on this farm is that actually the distance where the animals have to travel to get to the weigh and back to the field is quite minimal. So it's not like they're in pens for not days, but hours. And so the ones at the back of the group are going to be losing more weight by the time they get to the weigher. So there will be a gut fill impact, but I don't see it as a massive impact on this farm compared to other examples where those sheep are having to travel longer or be in the pens before weighing for longer.
So just on the crops, because there's a comment came in that asks, you know, moving from crop to crop is never ideal. You know, that transition, because so how long were they long enough on the clover to actually get used to it and then grow, or were they given enough time, basically?
So it's almost 2 weeks on white and white clover, and then 2 weeks onto red clover. So it was we were probably just beautifully hitting that where they were just getting onto the white clover when we moved towards the red clover. But because the red clover was also grass as well, so there was grass throughout all of that system. So what changed was the clover type rather than.
But strangely, as soon as we put them on to start with, the first week they went on, they gained 220 grams. The first week they went on, then that second week of being on, they started to lose, and then they seemed to just upset them forevermore. Then, so I don't know. It's strange, and it's not like it was just a red clover sward. I would say there's at least sort of 60% grass, wouldn't you, Liz, in it?
Yeah, it again varies over the year, but it's certainly not pure stands at all.
No.
And there's another question just about the lambs on the red clover. Were the lambs lacking any energy on the red clover? Did they seem, other than obviously the weighing and the growth rates, did they seem okay?
Yeah, they seemed okay. I think they probably looked a bit dull coated. They probably didn't look the happiest, you know. But as for energy, I don't know really, you know, without going into it.
And you mentioned, the change in their grazing behaviour changed quite a lot, didn't it? In terms of when they were then moved onto the grass, they seemed to they had a good desire to eat. I'm trying to think of the words.
It was strange when you watched them. it was quite strange. They went sort of mad as soon as they got off the red clover onto the grass and white clover. They went mad, like they hadn't eaten for a week, but they obviously had been. But you know, they were hammering it, which was so strange. And they've done that every time they've gone on to it. They've done that, which is strange. It's like almost like they don't like the red clover.
That's interesting. Just one or two quick ones then. I find it's interesting that we're trying to encourage a farmer to weigh less than to weigh. But just on the weighing, obviously, it's part of a lot of the stuff we've done in the past is encouraging farmers to weigh, and you can see the importance. Maybe it's a bit too much, but you can see the importance it's played on you to even monitor those ewe lambs. So, how valuable do you see it? And actually, would you have spotted them? You know, that dip in growth rates if you weren't weighing?
Probably not. No, don't you think, Liz? I still think it's a major thing to do. You've got to monitor growth, haven't you? And you know, you could have just turned a blind eye and never weighed them, and it might be frequently weighing them that's doing it, but I don't think it probably is really. But I still maintain it's a good thing. Go on, Liz.
And to clarify, we're not going to be discouraging Chris from weighing, and from this is a really unique data set that me and other sheep geeks are getting very excited about, because we don't have this sort of frequency of weighing on other farms. But certainly if we think that bringing them into a pen upsets them for a day, even half a day, do you mean it isn't necessarily helping the situation? But every other week would be beautifully done. Do you mean? But also, I have to, from Chris's perspective, he wants to weigh to understand what's happening. So that's also fine as well, isn't it? It depends on why you're doing it. But certainly, with just flick back to that graph for, do you mean? So you could be doing a point in time where you weighed. Do you mean you weighed here and it was in a low bit, and you weighed here and it was in a high bit? And do you mean in general, the trends are where we want them to be? The trend is moving up. It's not quite as steep as we want, but we have to say they have done what they needed to do. It's just in a quite an uneven pattern, but in reality, that's probably what happens. We just don't know it because not many people weigh with this level of frequency. So we will get difference of, do you mean, there's worm issues coming in, there's weather events coming in, there's rain, there's sun, do you mean, and all of those things. It's not like they're in an environmentally controlled shed. So we're probably reflecting what variation people are finding on farm. We've just got the data to demonstrate it.
But I suppose the difference is you because you of the weighing, you can make those changes and actually make sure you are getting to your targets. I suppose that's the key point. You can put in the interventions earlier and quicker and adapt. There is one or two questions I might leave to the end, but just two kind of similar type of things, and maybe you don't have an answer, but just something to look at. Could there be an issue with the palatability of the red clover? And then another question came in is, could it be the quality of the grass within the clover ley, as maybe reasons why they haven't performed as well?
But just the bit that's telling is the fact is they were hungry when they left it. So there's something going on that they're not. The lack of energy is because they're not taking enough in, so they're not growing because they haven't got enough energy within their system. So we have to look a bit further on, and probably not where the priority animals are going to be grazed next year until we have a bit of an understanding of what's going on with it.
So come back next year and we'll have the answer to that question, basically.
I'm not saying that.
Right, I'll put it back over to you for now, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. So we'll now move on to our next topic, which is measuring grass and forage. So Chris, do you want to just start by saying how often you're measuring your grass, how you're doing it, and what you'd recommend to others?
Yeah, so we're probably not doing it often enough. I'm measuring once a month with a plate meter. We've only just started doing it really this last year. I think it's a benefit, you know, especially when we start getting more and more sheep on the job. I think then I should probably become more proactive with it and sort of measuring every week. Probably try and take my focus onto measuring grass rather than weighing lambs every week. So yeah, I think it's definitely a benefit. We're in the early stages of it really. But we'll be doing more of it next year. I think we're doing more rotational grazing as well.
That's it. And Liz, why is it important to measure grass regularly? What does it tell you?
So it allows us to sort of understand. So for Chris's example, so we know that lambing during the year that he had a bad lambing, so with the iodine issue as well, is that it was perceived that there was also an issue about grass amount. So there wasn't enough grass about on that farm. So part of the reason why we put in grass measuring was just to track what was happening as we went into the lambing, not 20, just to make sure there was enough grass, particularly for the lambing outdoors group. So that's why we did it particularly on this farm. Why we do it on other farms is just to get a feel for what's happening on the farm, and also gives us a heads up probably a couple of weeks before we get to a situation where everything's burnt up, to allow us to put interventions in quicker. So if we know that the grass is on a downward turn, what can we do in terms of, do we need to release more land, or we've got silage ground coming back in, we know we're going to be okay. So it just helps in terms of for sort of forward planning from a grassland perspective. And so that's why we tend to do it, and it just gives a feel for, particularly this time of year. We know from this time of year is that it's only ever really, on most farms, ever really going to go downwards up until next spring, just because we're eating into it all the time. So it just gives a feel for actually how much grass are we taking through the winter, could we have available for the next spring.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. And I think from this as well, from the data that Chris collected, we could also tell that we could also take a field out to reseed with a herbal ley. So this leads us nicely into the next.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said, Sarah, just to talk through the slide. So this is the pasture readings that Chris has done in the last few months. Just for a reference, 1500 is around about 4 centimetres, so just about to your toe on a welly, and 2000 is sort of just ankle height. So that just gives you a range in terms of where we are. So you can see over the winter of last year, we were doing reasonably tight in terms of grass. But as you can see, March, April time was reasonably healthy for that time of year in terms of how much grass was around, and certainly combine that with the dry time. So it alludes, as Chris suggested, it's the understocking helped at that time, because I know other farms didn't have that amount of grass around at that time of year. And then what's interesting is that we're appearing to go into the, I keep doing the wrong one, sorry. We're appearing to go into the winter with a lot more grass than we probably did last year. So again, that will help in terms of what our spring is like, when sheep can return to that farm, all of those factors. So it just gives us an idea of what future plans can change. So every year isn't quite the same, because we just don't know how much grass we're going to be taking through to the spring.
That's it, and we'll touch on Chris's plans for autumn and winter at the end. So Chris, this year you have reseeded a field with a herbal ley. Why a herbal ley?
Really, it's what we want to be doing, going forward. Really, what sort of made me think this stuff's a good idea is we've got some cover strips on farm, and they had some chicory in them, and the sheep grazed them in sort of, throughout the spring period, and the only plant that was actively growing in that dry period was the chicory and the cover crops, and it was remarkable to watch. It was outgrowing any sort of grass, and it was the only thing that was giving a bite, really.
Yeah.
And that's why really I thought this is a good idea to have it in a ley. So okay. It's got some plantain in it as well.
Yeah. So this photograph that we can see on screen now, so this is your herbal ley. When was this drilled?
Drilled it mid-August. This was drilled. We ploughed it. It was a bit cobbly, probably. A bit too cobbly in places. It's not as good as that all over. But as a whole, it's not too bad. We'll just see how it does.
And Liz, do you just want to mention the list of varieties that are in it, because it is extensive?
So Chris is working with Germinal on some sort of demonstration plots within that field. So there's 4 mixtures that have been sown, and they're sort of indicated on the screen. So mixture number 1 is sort of the base one that every mixture has some perennial ryegrass, some timothy, white clover, a little bit of red clover, puna, chicory, and also plantain. And then in mixture 2, more herbs are added in. In mixture 3, we actually have a fesculolium, which is a cross between a fescue and a perennial ryegrass. And then in mixture 4, we have a tall fescue. So it's sort of exploring different ways to offer this sort of drought resistance. So fesculoliums have better rooting structure, as did fescue. So it's trying to give a bit more sort of drought tolerance to these mixtures. So that's why it's interesting to look at all 4 really and see how they perform at Chris's.
Okay, so we can see what the reseed looks like at the moment. What are the plans for managing that over the next 6 to 12 months? I'll go to you, Chris.
We'll just see how it goes, really, Sarah.
Yeah.
Like I say, it's not all as good as that. I might run some lambs over it. Helen came out from Germany and had a look at it yesterday with us. She says hold off for a little bit longer, give it another 2 weeks to see what happens. If it's really wet by then we probably won't go on it with sheep and make a mess. But if it's dry, I might just whip whatever fat lambs we've got left on the job. I might just put them over it just to take the tops out and then pull them back off it again. But it certainly won't get any hard grazing or anything like that.
Yeah. And Liz, what would be the benefit of putting those lambs in to graze it a little bit?
The risk is if frosts come, there's going to be quite a lot of frost kill on it, just because there's quite a lot of plant there. So at the minute, it's a balance between getting those plants established and then also a gentle graze before winter comes, just to take some of that sort of some of it would be up to 10-12 centimeters in places. So it's just trying to tidy that up in case there's any frost that comes through.
Okay.
But I agree, it's got to be driven by ground conditions. If it's wet, you just end up making you'll just end up ruining it.
Interestingly, the chicory and the plantain have really the ones that have kicked on, and they're growing very well. The chicory, it's got a root sort of like that sort of already down, and it's an incredible thing how it goes about its their business, really.
Yeah,
so we're looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a part of the job going forward. It's hopefully going to finish lambs this time. And I think it's a good thing for soil structure, and as a part of the rotation, especially rotationally grazing it, I think it's going to be a benefit. And again, hopefully it won't need any fertiliser.
That's it.
Certainly
No, it'll be good to hear how that goes on, and we'll talk about it at Chris's next event. Joseph, are there any questions on the herbal ley?
None at the moment, but I'm just conscious of time, so maybe if we continue on, and I'll pop in at the end with the last 1 or 2 remaining questions.
Lovely, thank you. So we'll just finish just talking about the plans for the autumn and winter. So Chris is actually looking a bit more at his soil. So we've got somebody to come out and do a soil health scorecard on some of his fields where he is having problems such as that with the red clover, and that's looking at the chemical composition and the physical composition of the soil as well, and also the biology. So we're counting worms and things like that. But again, we will talk about that next year when we've got the results back. Liz, do you just want to talk about the plans for Chris for the next couple of months going into winter?
So Chris has got quite an interesting system, is that actually most of those, as he's alluded to, his ewe lambs are on crops, his ewes are on stubble turnip, so actually he hasn't got many animals on farm over that winter. So what you'll see on the screen at the moment is a feed budget, which is based on kilos of dry matter per hectare. So the measurements that Chris is taking once a month will be then used to actually refine this budget. So this is forecasting forward what we think the pasture cover would be at the end of March. Chris is in this really fortunate position because he's taken a lot of stock off that farm, and yes, that does have a cost associated with it. It means that this rest period, so we're aiming for grass to have at least 90 days, if not 120-day rest period over the winter. So it means that not only is Chris got quite a lot of grass now, because he's taken the animals off, by the time he comes to the spring, it'll be a nice amount. So compared to last year where we were sort of Jan, Feb 1500, we're forecasting to be around about 2000. So that's just, it's a nicer place to be in terms of for turnout of those Feb lambing ewes, and also to plan sort of outdoor lambing systems for those, for the outdoor group. So that it's just quite an interesting system because of that movement of most of the animals off farm.
Okay, brilliant. So I think what we'll do now, just in the interest of time, is Joseph, do you just want to come in and ask the remaining questions? Because I think there was still quite a few more on the red clover, wasn't there?
So I just well, there's a few kind of outside. There was one or two comments on the red clover. I think I've asked them in terms of the variety. There was one comment though, just on finishing and your kill out percentages, just in general on your lambs. What kind of kill out are you getting, Chris?
We're around about the 48%. They kill out fairly well, really. Try and get a 19 kilo carcass, 19 to 20 kilo, really, about 48% this time of year, anyway.
Cool. And then we've had, just to be honest, more of a few kind of comments rather than questions. So we just had one in where someone was about the boluses. They were using mineral drenches, but they've changed to boluses, and they found that using a bolus twice a year has made a big difference in their ewes and lambs. So just more kind of saying their own experience, which is really good to hear.
That's good to know.
And then about, we were talking actually just about the grazing of these herbal leys and our crops, and just again another comment, I need to be aware of damaging smaller clover plants, perhaps more than others in those crops. So just the comments that were coming in, and I think hopefully I haven't forgotten anyone, but I think that's all the questions for now.
Brilliant.
No doubt
Thank
more
you.
will come in just as I finish.
That's it. So Chris, you did mention about increasing your stocking rates. What are you hoping to get to numbers wise?
Well, I think we'd like to be sort of at least sort of 500 ewes at home, really, and then we've got sort of another 35 acre off farm in a block, which we have all year round. That's where the ewe lambs are going to go this time, so there'll be sort of 150 ewe lambs there. Whether we took that amount going forward once we get up to sort of 500 ewes where we're at home, we might only took 100 ewe lambs or something. But yeah, I mean, if opportunities keep arising, to take more land on or whatever, then I'm always sort of fairly open, and we would really like to keep getting, bigger if we can.
Yeah, and just looking at that winter feed budget, Liz, how many ewes will Chris be able to sustain on that before he has to look at land elsewhere?
It's an excellent question, so that I can't answer for that. But in terms of what we know from that is that compared to other feed budgets, we're going in with probably an extra 500 kilos of grass than we need. So, so we certainly can stock, even if some of Chris's existing animals, they could stay on that farm for longer this winter. But as Chris has sort of explained to me before, if he doesn't stock that land, he might lose it. So he needs to sort of put animals off farm to guarantee that land for when he does expand. So we certainly, I think the target of 500 ewes is easily achievable on what he's doing at the moment, and remembering that this is only year one of rotational grazing, so we know that grass yields will increase further as the subdivision increases, which is the plan that Chris has for this coming year.
That's it. So it'll be lovely to see the developments you make next year, Chris. So I'm just conscious of time, so we'll just start to bring the webinar to a close. So if you don't already receive events or information from AHDB, please do sign up. There is a keep in touch form, the details are there. Thank you, Liz. And also make sure, if you don't already, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where you'll see the lovely videos that Chris put out this week. I'll just mention some of the resources that are available from AHDB. So we have lots and lots of brilliant resources on managing grass and forage. So please do make sure you look at those. They are on the AHDB website in the knowledge library part. So you'll find them all there. This webinar will also be recorded as well as others. So if you want, you can go and watch that again, and they are all available on YouTube. There are some other meetings coming up which we might be interested in. So the next one is the 29th of October, so this time next week, and that's with Adrian Coombe, another of our strategic farmers, and he's particularly focusing on soil, which I'm sure will be interesting. We've then got another meeting on the 2nd of November looking at fodder beet, specifically for sheep systems. And then we'll, of course, there's lots of other meetings available, and they're all listed on the event part of the website. So I'd just like to start by saying a huge thank you to Chris and for Liz for their input into this afternoon's webinar. Also, thank you to my colleague Joseph for asking the questions, and also for working behind the scenes to ensure we didn't encounter any technical difficulties. Finally, a big thank you to everyone who has been listening. I really hope you have enjoyed the conversation and found it useful. When the webinar ends, you will be taken to a survey. I would really appreciate it if you could fill that out. It just helps us tailor these events to your business needs. So if you can, please do take a couple of minutes just to complete that. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.